February 15th, 1942, Singapore. 85,000 Commonwealth troops surrendered to just 35,000 Japanese soldiers. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Japanese had crushed British forces in 73 days of campaigning. The psychological impact was devastating not just for Britain, but for how Japan viewed the entire war in Asia. The Japanese victories had been comprehensive. Following Singapore, the Japanese 15th Army conquered all of Burma with initially just 2 divisions. They forced the longest fighting withdrawal in British Army history, nearly 1,000 miles from Rangoon to India. British forces were described as beaten, puzzled and resentful. Most members of the British Indian Army left Burma with the belief that the Japanese were unstoppable in the jungle. This created profound Japanese overconfidence. The Japanese soldier was regarded as king of the jungle. They had achieved considerable moral ascendancy over Allied forces, who genuinely believed Japanese troops were invincible in jungle warfare. Japanese commanders had demonstrated superior mobility through terrain the British considered impassable. These victories shaped Japanese defensive assumptions. They expected British forces would retreat when supply lines were cut. They assumed jungle terrain provided them with defensive advantage. Most critically, Japanese commanders did not anticipate British forces capable of deep penetration operations. That assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. February 13th, 1943. 3,000 men of 77th Indian Infantry Brigade crossed the Chindwin River into Japanese-held Burma. Leading them was Major General Ord Charles Wingate, Distinguished Service Order and 2 bars. He was a 40-year-old eccentric who grew beards, ate raw onions for health, and scrubbed himself with rubber brushes instead of bathing. But his revolutionary long-range penetration doctrine would change warfare forever. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi commanded Japan's 18th Division in Burma. His post-war admission was damning. Following the capture of Mandalay on May 1, 1942, 18th Division was employed in mopping up operations. I had never anticipated such a risky plan of counter-offensive on the part of the British forces, and I was therefore handicapped by the lack of reserves with which to meet this threat. The crossing itself revealed Japanese unpreparedness. Mutaguchi's post-war statement was even more revealing. The place which the enemy had chosen as his crossing point of the Chindwin, opposite Shitang, was the borderline of the defence sectors of 18th and 33rd Divisions and was not carefully watched. For this reason, the Wingate force crossed the Chindwin unopposed. 3,000 enemy troops penetrated deep into Burma without Japanese opposition. It was a stunning intelligence and defensive failure. The Japanese had gaps in their supposedly secure rear areas. Lance Corporal Shinsaku Honma of the 33rd Division described the confusion. While we had been enjoying a peaceful occupation of Monowa, we were told that a British force had penetrated into Burma. On March 3, 1943, Major Ichiro Nasu, commanding the Nasu Battalion, was killed in an unexpected clash with Gurkhas in the jungle. A battalion commander killed in what should have been a secure rear area. British columns operated with devastating effectiveness. Brigadier Michael Calvert's Column 3 demolished the railway in 70 places on March 4, 1943. They targeted the critical Mandalay to Myitkyina line between Wunto and Indore. Brigadier Bernard Ferguson's Column 5 conducted similar extensive demolitions 2 days later. The Bonchang Gorge Railway Bridge was destroyed. Japanese supply infrastructure throughout northern Burma came under systematic attack. What made deep penetration possible was revolutionary integration of capabilities that the Japanese never anticipated. Each Chindit column was a self-contained combined arms unit of 300 to 370 men. They included infantry with 9 Bren light machine guns and 3 2-inch mortars. They had support weapons including 4 Boys anti-tank rifles, 2 Vickers medium machine guns, and 2 light anti-aircraft guns. Reconnaissance platoons from Burma Rifles provided local knowledge of terrain and villages. Sabotage specialists from 142 Commando Company handled demolitions of bridges, railways and supply dumps. Royal Air Force detachments with radios coordinated air support. Royal Corps of Signals Communicators maintained contact with headquarters in India. Royal Army Medical Corps personnel treated casualties under impossible conditions. All equipment was transported by 57 mules per British column. The training these men received transformed ordinary soldiers into jungle specialists. At Gwalior in central India, Wingate's training centre pushed men to their limits. They learned to navigate by stars and compass through featureless jungle. They practiced living off minimal rations. They trained with mules until man and animal became inseparable units. They learned to move silently through dense vegetation. They practiced immediate action drills for ambushes. Most critically, they learned that survival depended on the man beside them. This training created units capable of operating independently for months behind enemy lines. The mules themselves were critical to success. 57 mules per British column, 64 for Gurkha columns, carried mortars, machine guns, ammunition, radio batteries, medical supplies, and explosives. Each mule had a name. Each belonged to a specific platoon. Men grew so attached to their mules that they would risk their lives to save wounded animals. One Chindit recalled how his platoon wept when their mule was shot crossing a river, the animal they had lived with for 6 months gone in seconds. These were not just transport animals. They were members of the unit. Air supply was the crucial enabler that made everything possible. The United States Army Air Force 1st Air Commando Group, led by Colonels Philip Cochrane and John Allison, with the motto, "Any place, any time, anywhere," provided comprehensive air support that revolutionized warfare. C-47 Dakota transports delivered supplies in canisters dropped by parachute. Waco gliders inserted troops and heavy equipment including bulldozers to build airstrips. P-51 Mustang fighters provided air cover against Japanese fighters. B-25 Mitchell bombers conducted ground attacks on Japanese positions. L-1 Vigilant and L-5 Sentinel light aircraft evacuated casualties and conducted reconnaissance behind enemy lines. 6 experimental helicopters performed the world's first combat rescue missions. Royal Air Force Squadrons 31, 62, 117, and 194 flew supply missions continuously, often at night, navigating by dead reckoning to find small clearings in trackless jungle. Pilots faced Japanese fighters, monsoon storms, and mountains shrouded in cloud. They flew at treetop level to drop supplies with pinpoint accuracy. A single missed drop could mean starvation for an entire column. The margin for error was 0. During Operation Longcloth, Royal Air Force aircraft delivered 303 tons of supplies in 178 sorties. Each supply drop required precise coordination. Columns would signal with ground panels or smoke. Aircraft would circle to identify the correct location. Then came the drop, parachutes blossoming as containers descended. Men would rush to recover supplies before Japanese patrols arrived. The whole operation might take 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes meant survival. Royal Air Force officers embedded with every Chindit column could call directly for supply drops, close air support strikes, medical evacuation, and reconnaissance. This created seamless ground-to-air integration unprecedented in warfare. A column commander could request ammunition in the morning and have it delivered by afternoon. He could call airstrikes on Japanese positions within hours. This responsiveness gave Chindits a massive advantage over Japanese forces dependent on road and river supply lines that extended hundreds of miles. Royal Air Force officers embedded with every Chindit column could call directly for supply drops, close air support strikes, medical evacuation, and reconnaissance. This created seamless ground-to-air integration unprecedented in warfare. Radio communications made coordination possible across vast distances. Wireless set number 18. Mark III manpack radios with 5 to 10 mile range connected columns within a brigade. Wireless set number. 22 units with up to 20 miles range provided longer range coordination between brigades and headquarters. Wingate emphasized in standing orders that use your wireless telegraphy to capacity. It is your greatest weapon. Intelligence is useless unless it is passed on. Use your wireless telegraphy. But radio operations behind enemy lines presented unique challenges. Batteries lasted only 12 hours of transmission time. Charging required hand-cranked generators that took hours of exhausting labor. Radio operators had to encode every message to prevent Japanese interception. They worked in constant fear that Japanese direction-finding equipment would pinpoint their location. Despite these challenges, the wireless network held the entire operation together. Without it, columns would have been isolated, blind, and vulnerable. The daily reality of Chindit life was an endurance test that broke strong men. They marched carrying 70 to 72-pound loads in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The jungle was not the romantic adventure of films. It was a green hell of thorns that ripped clothing, leeches that attached to every exposed patch of skin, and mosquitoes that swarmed in clouds. Water was often contaminated. Men developed dysentery that left them barely able to walk, yet they walked anyway because staying behind meant probable death. Food consisted of K rations designed for 5 days emergency use, stretched to weeks or months. Each man received perhaps 1,200 calories per day when they needed 3,000 or more for the physical exertion demanded. They lost weight rapidly. Men who entered Burma at 10 stones left at 6 or 7 stones, skeletal figures held together by will alone. Hunger became a constant companion that gnawed at concentration and sapped strength. At night they slept in the open or under ground sheets, never undressing, always ready to move instantly if Japanese patrols approached. Guards rotated every 2 hours. No fires were permitted that might give away positions. They ate cold rations in silence. They learned to sleep despite exhaustion, despite fear, despite the sounds of the jungle around them. Sleep deprivation accumulated until men hallucinated, seeing Japanese soldiers that were not there or missing real threats. Medical care was primitive. Doctors operated by torchlight with minimal equipment. Antibiotics were limited. Malaria was endemic. Scrub typhus killed through fever and delirium. Infected wounds turned gangrenous without proper treatment. Men developed ulcers on their legs that refused to heal in the humid conditions. Dysentery and cholera threatened every water source. The medical officers performed miracles with almost nothing, saving lives that should have been lost. General Numata, Chief of Staff of Southern Army, provided the critical Japanese assessment. It was found as a result of the Wingate campaign and the Japanese operations in opposition. There too that the terrain in North Burma was favourable for guerrilla warfare by small bodies of crack troops, but it was very difficult to defend the territory because the enemy could not easily be engaged. This admission was revolutionary. The same Japanese forces that had driven the British from Burma in 1942 now acknowledged they could not effectively counter British jungle operations. Numata's conclusion was stark. Under the circumstances, it would therefore be best to give up defensive tactics and resort to an offensive to destroy the enemy's bases for counter-operations, such as Imphal and Kohima. Operation Longcloth changed Japanese strategic thinking fundamentally. Mutaguchi later conceded the expedition changed his entire strategic thinking. The first Chindit expedition, though suffering 818 casualties, 27% of the force, provoked Japan into launching Operation Yugo. This would prove to be the disastrous Imphal-Kohima offensive that resulted in approximately 55,000 Japanese casualties from an 85,000-man force, mostly from starvation and disease. British soldiers returned from hell having proven a critical point. Of 3,000 who entered Burma, 2,182 returned, but only 600 were fit for further service. The survivors had marched over 1,000 miles carrying 72-pound loads through some of the world's most challenging terrain. They were sustained by airdrops totaling 303 tons, delivered in 178 sorties. They had endured temperatures of 110 to 112 degrees Fahrenheit. They suffered tropical diseases and starvation on K rations designed for just 5 days' use. They faced constant Japanese pursuit, but they had shattered the myth of Japanese jungle invincibility. The Japanese were about to be shocked again, on an even larger scale. On the night of March 5th, 1944, the largest airborne operation since Creek commenced. 52 gliders towed by 26 Dakota aircraft approached landing zones codenamed Broadway and Piccadilly, deep in Japanese-held Burma. The first glider touched down at 6:12 post-meridian. Within 1 week, 600 Dakota sorties would transport 9,000 men behind enemy lines. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. General Numata's admission was devastating. Consequently, the second Wingate expedition in March 1944 took the Japanese completely by surprise. There was no special preparation to meet the expedition. He continued, because of this lack of preparation, the second Wingate operation threw Japanese units into confusion, and the higher command, without sufficient information, could only gather local units together more or less indiscriminately. Such time-saving measures resulted in the Japanese forces being repulsed everywhere. The Japanese timeline of awareness reveals systematic failure. The massive airborne landings occurred on March 5th, but Japanese forces did not become aware of the main landings until March 9th, 3 full days later. Even then, Numata admitted, Information available then was insufficient, and we did not think that it was on a large scale. It was not until the beginning of April that Japanese command realized the enemy was engaged in a serious and large-scale, penetrating operation with a powerful core. 4 weeks of confusion while 12,000 Chindits established fortified strongholds, built airstrips in 13 to 36 hours, and launched operations across northern Burma. The timing could not have been worse for Japan. The airborne landings occurred the night before the Japanese were to begin the Imphal offensive. This was the operation Mutaguchi hoped would drive the British from India and change the war's trajectory. Instead, he faced a strategic nightmare in his rear areas precisely when he needed to concentrate forces forward. The stronghold concept was Wingate's masterstroke that transformed deep penetration operations. Broadway, White City, Aberdeen and Blackpool were fortified bases deep in enemy territory that served as anchors for offensive operations. Each had airstrips built by bulldozers flown in by glider, constructed in just 13 to 36 hours of backbreaking labour. Engineers worked through the night clearing trees, levelling ground, and laying pierced steel planking for runways capable of handling Dakota transports. White City, established in March 1944, became the most famous stronghold. Located astride the main Mandalay to Myitkyina Railway, it controlled Japan's primary supply route to northern Burma. The position was defended by earthworks with firing positions dug into red laterite soil that became concrete hard under the tropical sun. Barbed wire obstacles created killing zones. Anti-personnel mines ringed the perimeter. Machine gun nests provided interlocking fields of fire. Field artillery with 25-pounder guns could engage targets at ranges exceeding 10,000 yards. 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns protected against Japanese air attacks that came daily once the position was discovered. The Japanese attacked White City repeatedly for 7 weeks, throwing regiment after regiment against the defences. Each attack was repulsed with heavy Japanese casualties. Artillery fire shattered assault formations before they reached the wire. Machine guns cut down those who made it through the artillery barrage. The Chindits held, resupplied by air, reinforced by air, supported by airstrikes that devastated Japanese assembly areas. No Japanese attack ever breached the stronghold defences. Floater columns patrolled perimeters to counterattack approaching enemies before they could concentrate for major assaults. These mobile columns would slip out at night, ambush Japanese supply parties, raid headquarters locations, then disappear back into the jungle. They kept Japanese forces off balance, never allowing them time to prepare coordinated attacks. The combination of fixed stronghold and mobile columns created a defensive system the Japanese could not crack. Strongholds enabled sustained offensive operations from fixed bases 200-plus miles behind enemy lines. Artillery support meant columns could call for fire missions against targets beyond their own weapons range. Medical evacuation capability meant wounded could be flown to hospitals in India within hours, rather than dying in the jungle. Ammunition and food arrived by air daily. The strongholds were islands of British power deep in Japanese-controlled territory, positions that forced the enemy to divert entire divisions just to contain them. One innovation alone revolutionized casualty survival: the L-5B Sentinel light aircraft, modified to carry one stretcher patient through a large rear door with folded-down rear seat, could operate from crude jungle strips with only 600-foot takeoff capability. During Operation Thursday, light aircraft flew 7,500 sorties and evacuated 2,200 wounded men. This dramatically reduced evacuation time from days to hours. 40 L-1 and L-5 aircraft were lost, along with 5 pilots. In stark contrast, Operation Longcloth wounded faced horrific choices. Wingate's orders were stark: get rid of casualties, never keep serious cases with the column. Seriously wounded were left behind with morphine and small food supplies, sometimes in villages when possible. This policy, agreed to by every Chindit beforehand, prevented slowing columns but condemned wounded to probable death or Japanese captivity. The air evacuation capability in 1944 changed this calculus entirely, enabling wounded to reach rear hospitals in India within hours. Individual acts of courage under impossible conditions defied human limits. Lieutenant George Albert Cairns was born December 12, 1913 in Sidcup, Kent. The 30-year-old bank clerk and Somerset light infantry officer was leading an attack on a Japanese bunker at Pagoda Hill near White City on March 16, 1944. A Japanese officer attacked him with a sword and hacked off his left arm. Cairns shot the officer dead. Then he picked up the fallen sword with his remaining arm and continued leading the charge, slashing left and right. He killed and wounded several more Japanese soldiers before collapsing from blood loss and 2 bayonet wounds. His last words to Brigadier Calvert were, "Have we won, sir? Was it all right? Did we do our stuff? Don't worry about me." He died the following day, March 19, 1944. His Batman Private and Coal said simply, "He died a hero." The battle resulted in 42 Japanese killed, and Cairns' one-armed sword charge so inspired his comrades that the Japanese were completely routed. This was described as a very rare occurrence at the time. His Victoria Cross was not gazetted until May 17, 1949, 5 years later, making it the last World War II Victoria Cross awarded. The recommendation had been destroyed in Wingate's plane crash. Rifleman Tulbahadur Pun's charge defied probability itself. On June 23, 1944, at McGowan Railway Bridge's Red House bunker, the 21-year-old Gurkha from 3rd Battalion, 6th Gurkha Rifles watched intense crossfire wipe out his entire section except 3 men. The section commander led a charge and was badly wounded. The 3rd man fell wounded. Pun seized the fallen Bren gun and charged alone across 30 yards of open ankle-deep mud, firing from the hip through shattering concentration of automatic fire. The dawn sun at his back made him a perfect silhouette target. Every Japanese gun in the Red House opened fire on that lone running figure. He reached the Red House unscathed, inexplicably, miraculously, impossibly unscathed. A Japanese soldier burst out of the bunker entrance. Pun killed him with his kukri knife, the traditional curved blade of the Gurkhas. A second soldier appeared, dispatched with kukri, the blade slashing through flesh and bone. A third soldier engaged in hand-to-hand fight, kukri driving into Japanese flesh. He killed 3 total in close combat, put 5 more to flight through sheer terror at this demon who would not die, captured 2 light machine guns and ammunition, then provided covering fire enabling his platoon to reach the objective. The battle for McGowan was among the bloodiest of the entire Burma campaign. The town sat astride the Mandalay to Mietkina Railway, a critical junction the Japanese were determined to hold. 77th Brigade attacked with 3rd Battalion, 6th Gurkha Rifles and 1st Battalion King's Regiment Liverpool. The Japanese had fortified every building, dug bunkers into every strong point, and prepared to fight to the last man. They did. The fighting was house to house, room to room, bunker to bunker, grenades thrown through windows, bayonet charges into machine gun fire, flamethrowers burning out positions, artillery fire that reduced buildings to rubble, yet still concealed Japanese defenders. The Gurkhas advanced metre by metre, paying in blood for every position. The King's Regiment fought alongside them, 2 battalions against a determined enemy who refused to yield. It took 9 days to capture McGowan. When the last Japanese position fell on June 27, 1944, the cost was staggering. 3rd Battalion 6th Gurkha Rifles had entered the battle with approximately 900 all ranks. They suffered 485 casualties, more than half the battalion, 126 killed, 352 wounded, 7 missing. Every officer had been killed or wounded. The battalion was so depleted it could barely function as a combat unit. This action saved Major James Lumley, father of actress Joanna Lumley, who decades later would lead the successful campaign for Gurkha settlement rights in Britain. Pun received his Victoria Cross on March 3, 1945 at Red Fort, Delhi from Field Marshal Viscount Wavell. Captain Michael Almond, also of 6th Gurkha Rifles, died the same day at the same battle. The company commander crawled ahead toward a Japanese machine gun nest and was struck down by a burst of fire, his wounds proving fatal. 2 Victoria Crosses earned in the same battle testified to the extraordinary courage required at McGowan. The most compelling evidence of Chindit effectiveness came from Japan's commanders themselves. Lieutenant General Mutaguchi's post-war assessment was unequivocal. The Chindit invasion had a decisive effect on these operations at Imphal Kohima. They drew off the whole of 53rd Division and parts of 15th Division, 1 regiment of which would have turned the scales at Kohima. The force diversions were substantial. The entire 53rd Division, Burma Area Army's strategic reserve, was rushed to counter Chindits at White City instead of being available for Imphal-Kohima battles that ran from March to July 1944. The 24th Independent Mixed Brigade was redirected from Moulmein. Elements of the 2nd Division were diverted. General Kawabe cobbled together approximately 20,000 troops to confront Chindits at Indore. Japanese monograph. Number 134 stated the operations greatly affected army operations and eventually led to total abandonment of northern Burma. Supply line disruption had cascading effects that rippled through the entire Japanese position in Burma. The Indore to Homolin supply route, the primary route to the Chindwin River and forward Japanese forces, was completely severed by White City stronghold. Every truck, every railway car, every supply convoy bound for the Imphal offensive had to find alternate routes or simply never arrived. A Royal Air Force officer embedded with Chindits discovered a major Japanese supply dump containing thousands of tons of ammunition, rations and medical supplies. United States Army Air Force aircraft destroyed it in a single devastating raid, flames visible for miles across the jungle. The Japanese 31st Division at Kohima initially had 21 days' supplies when they began their offensive. They expected resupply would come forward from their bases in Burma. It never came. Major Ketsu of the Japanese staff stated plainly that the loss of the supply route had vital effect on Kohima operation. Without food, without ammunition, without medical supplies, the Japanese offensive ground to a halt. Men starved within sight of their objectives. They ate grass, roots, anything to survive. Disease ravaged formations that lacked basic medicine. The finest Japanese soldiers died not from British bullets, but from starvation and sickness. General Naka commanding the 18th Division stated that Chindit operations completely cut off supply route, making impossible holding operation. His division, spread across northern Burma, found itself fighting on two fronts simultaneously, forward against 14th Army, rear against Chindit columns that appeared from nowhere to attack supply lines, headquarters, and communication nodes. Resources meant for the offensive were diverted to protect supposedly secure rear areas. Troops who should have been attacking Imphal were instead chasing Chindit columns through trackless jungle. The railway demolitions were particularly effective. 70 cuts in the railway between Wunto and Indau meant weeks of repair work under constant air attack and Chindit harassment. Each demolished bridge required materials and labour to rebuild. Each torn-up rail section had to be replaced. The Japanese lacked the engineering resources to repair so much damage simultaneously. The railway, Japan's primary supply artery in northern Burma, became worthless for months at the exact moment they needed it most. The timing proved catastrophic for Japan. Mutaguchi's own words captured the disaster. The airborne landings were made during the night previous to the day on which we were to begin the Imphal operation. It was a matter of great regret and concern to me that Burma Area Army switched one entire division to cope with the enemy airborne force, especially at a time when the provision of one regiment of 53rd Division would have turned the scales at Kohima. General Namata summarized the strategic impact. These airborne forces proved a devastating factor in cutting lines of communication, contributed materially to Japanese failure in Imphal and Hukang operations. General Matsui went further. If Wingate decided timing, he was genius of war. Sir Robert Thompson's assessment captured the narrow margins. At Imphal-Kohima it was touch and go. Any extra forces could have tipped scales. The Chindits had diverted the equivalent of 1.5 divisions at the critical moment. Gurkha battalions formed the elite core of Chindit operations, proving that the bonds between Britain and her Commonwealth allies were forged in more than words. The 3rd Battalion, 6th Gurkha Rifles in 77th Brigade landed by glider at Broadway on the night of March 5, 1944. They established White City stronghold, holding against repeated Japanese assaults for 7 weeks. Then they marched 160 miles through enemy territory to Mogong, fighting actions every step of the way. Their assault on Mogong on June 23, 1944, earned 2 Victoria Crosses in a single day of battle, a distinction so rare it testified to extraordinary courage under fire. Of 900 all ranks who entered Burma, they suffered 485 casualties over the campaign. 126 killed, 352 wounded, 7 missing. A 54% casualty rate. Yet they earned 2 Victoria Crosses, 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 6 Military Crosses, 12 military medals, 3 Indian Orders of Merit, 5 Indian Distinguished Service Medals, and 3 American Silver Stars. The decorations represented perhaps 5% of the courage displayed, most acts of valour going unrecognised in the chaos of continuous combat. The 3rd Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles in Operation Longcloth suffered approximately 400 casualties, including 74 prisoners of war who faced brutal treatment in Japanese captivity. The survivors, skeletal men who had endured hell, were rebuilt into what one account called the ultimate Japanese killing machine in 25th Indian Division. They brought hard-won knowledge of Japanese tactics, understanding of jungle warfare, and absolute determination never to be beaten again. That knowledge proved invaluable in the battles that finally drove Japan from Burma. Gurkha columns fielded 369 men versus 306 for British columns. They carried the same 60-pound packs plus weapons and ammunition. They marched the same distances through the same jungle. They ate the same insufficient rations, suffered the same diseases, endured the same hardships. But they brought a fighting spirit rooted in 2 centuries of service to the British Crown, a tradition that made surrender unthinkable and retreat shameful. When Gurkhas fixed bayonets and charged with their kukris drawn, Japanese defenders broke and ran. The psychological impact of these short, stocky men who fought with cold ferocity was profound. West African troops demonstrated extraordinary resilience under impossible conditions. The 3rd West African Brigade, consisting of 6th, 7th and 12th Battalion's Nigeria Regiment from 81st Division, was specifically requested by Wingate based on their Somaliland and Abyssinia performance. They were the only non-European, non-Gurkha brigade with full brigade status in Chindit operations. Japanese testimony validated their effectiveness. A Japanese diary noted, "Not afraid to die, excellent physique and very brave, fighting against these soldiers very troublesome." During White City's evacuation, when the brigade marched north, historian David Rooney noted the brigade was buoyed up by cheerful resilience of African soldiers. They head-loaded stores that mules could not manage. Their use of Hausa language provided communication security. Japanese could not comprehend it. The 7th Nigerian Battalion successfully attacked Thayung village in April 1944, launched attacks on Maulu, and conducted successful ambushes. In July 1944, they advanced against well-prepared Japanese positions during monsoon conditions at Hill 60, demonstrating courage that impressed even British observers accustomed to extraordinary valour. The human cost was staggering, but survivors forged an unbreakable brotherhood. Operation Longcloth casualties tell a brutal story. Of 3,000 men, 818 became casualties, a 27 to 33% casualty rate. 450 were killed in action, 368 missing or captured. Of 2,182 who returned, only 600 were fit for further service, just 27% of returnees. The remaining 1,582 were so debilitated they received medical discharges. Of 210 to 239 captured, 168 died in Japanese captivity, a 60 to 80% prisoner of war death rate in Rangoon Central Jail. Operation Thursday was worse in absolute numbers. Official casualty figures showed 297 officer casualties, 102 killed or died of wounds, 171 wounded, 24 missing. 3,627 other ranks casualties, 888 killed or died of wounds, 2,255 wounded, 484 missing. Total 1,396 killed, 2,434 wounded. Over half required hospitalization with special nutritional diets. At Mokwong, 77th Brigade suffered 47 officers plus 729 other ranks killed or wounded, a 50% casualty rate. The York and Lancaster Battalion saw only 398 of 900 men make the final march. Disease was as deadly as combat. Medical examinations documented Chindit syndrome, a combination of malaria, dysentery, ulcerated septic sores, and weight loss averaging 3 stones or 42 pounds. Many were reduced from 9 to 10 stones, 126 to 140 pounds, down to 6 to 7 stones, 84 to 98 pounds. 1/3 of body weight lost. When 111th Brigade was examined on July 8th, of 2,200 men present, Only 119 were judged fit for duty. Fewer than 5% of survivors were judged fit to continue operations. Lieutenant Philip Stibber's story exemplifies the nightmare. The Royal Sussex Regiment officer, fresh from Merton College, Oxford, was wounded and left behind at Hinther Village in March 1943. Captured by Japanese forces, he endured waterboarding, torture and starvation in Rangoon jail for 2 years. He developed Parkinson's disease from prison diet deficiencies. His memoir Return via Rangoon became a powerful testament to survival. He died January 17, 1997. Yet survivors maintained extraordinary morale. Bernard Ferguson wrote of the deep bonds with their mules. Men became passionately fond of their mules, not only the muleteers, but the whole platoon who owned them. I have seen men weeping at a mule's death who have not wept at a comrade's. Veterans reflected, whatever happened to them after their experiences in Burma, they knew that nothing else would ever be as bad. They remained Chindits for the rest of their days, members of a brotherhood forged in extreme adversity. British assessments of Chindit effectiveness remain conflicted to this day. Major General S. Woodburn Kirby's official history argued Chindit operations did little to aid Britain's 14th Army, and that maintaining 5 Chindit brigades aggravated the shortage of aircraft. Historian Raymond Callaghan concluded they had little direct impact on Slim's campaign after Wingate's death. Field Marshal Slim himself opposed expansion as too great a drain on resources. The criticisms have substantial merit. Casualty rates were horrific, 27% in 1943, with over 90% of Operation Thursday casualties estimated to have occurred under Stilwell's misuse of Chindits in conventional infantry roles. The 70th Division could have been employed conventionally. Aircraft were diverted from 14th Army at critical moments. Medical costs persisted for years through Chindit syndrome, yet Japanese commanders consistently validated effectiveness. Over 30 Japanese commanders contributing to monograph number 134 stated Chindit operations led to total abandonment of northern Burma. Mutaguchi, Numata, Naka, and Matsui, independent sources with no incentive to exaggerate British effectiveness, all confirmed substantial strategic impact. A letter found on a dead Japanese officer stated, "What happened in Burma? We must not forget Major General Ord Wingate. He planted himself centre stage and conducted all fronts with his baton, the Chindits. He reduced Japanese power to wage war on 4 Burma fronts, and so fatally affected the balance." The weight of adversary testimony is compelling. When enemy commanders admit their opponent had a decisive effect and diverted forces that would have turned the scales, this carries exceptional weight in historical assessment. Japanese Defense Agency manuals rated Chindit operations highly effective, noting the 6-week delay from Operation Thursday had appreciable effect on decreasing morale of Japanese troops. Wingate himself never saw the full impact. On March 24, 1944, just 3 weeks after Operation Thursday commenced, his overloaded B-25 Mitchell bomber crashed southwest of Imphal, killing all aboard including 2 war correspondents. He was 41 years old. His body was eventually reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery on November 10, 1950. His legacy was a transformed approach to jungle warfare, air-ground integration techniques that became standard, and the psychological restoration of British confidence after devastating defeats. The documented evidence demonstrates categorical reversal of Japanese strategic assumptions. In February 1943, Japanese forces believed British troops incapable of deep jungle penetration operations, could not sustain forces by air supply, would retreat when supply lines were cut, and posed no threat to supposedly secure rear areas. By August 1944, British forces had marched over 1,000 miles through enemy territory, operated for months sustained entirely by airdrops, destroyed infrastructure throughout northern Burma, forced diversion of 1.5 plus Japanese divisions, severed critical supply routes, and compelled senior Japanese commanders to admit British forces had achieved strategic impact. The operational statistics are unambiguous. 12,000 Chindits operating behind Japanese lines inflicted 5,381 Japanese killed, 706 wounded, and 86 captured during Operation Thursday. They cut railways in 70-plus places. They destroyed documented supplies including 20-plus dumps by a single brigade. They blocked main supply routes for 7 weeks. They created conditions that multiple Japanese commanders stated had vital effect on critical battles. Most importantly, Japan's own commanders provided validation. Mutaguchi stated, "I had found my match." Numata stated the operation took the Japanese completely by surprise, threw Japanese units into confusion, resulted in forces being repulsed everywhere. Matsui stated if Wingate decided timing, he was genius of war. The adversary testimony, consistent across multiple independent Japanese sources, confirms Chindit operations fundamentally altered Japanese strategic calculations at the campaign's decisive moment. The British reversal was complete. From beaten, puzzled and resentful forces fleeing Burma in 1942, Commonwealth troops became forces that Japanese commanders admitted they could not easily be engaged. They operated in terrain Japan supposedly dominated. They forced tactical and strategic responses that contributed to Japan's worst military defeat. The myth of Japanese jungle invincibility died in Burma's jungles, killed by British, Gurkha and West African soldiers who endured impossible conditions to prove, in the words they earned through blood and suffering, that the boldest measures are indeed the safest. The cost was terrible. 1,396 killed, 2,434 wounded, thousands so debilitated they never fully recovered. But they accomplished their mission. They proved British forces could match Japanese jungle capabilities. They diverted enemy divisions at the decisive moment, and they earned recognition from the adversary they defeated, the ultimate military validation. Lieutenant General Mutaguchi's final assessment captured what the Japanese learned the hard way. "I realized what loss this was. I had found my match." Those words, from the commander who had conquered Burma in 1940, too, validated everything the Chindits endured. The Japanese never expected British forces to march 1,000 miles behind their lines. They never expected systematic destruction of supply infrastructure. They never expected operations that would tie down divisions at the decisive moment. They never expected to meet their match in the jungle they thought they dominated. They were wrong on every count, and Japan's commanders admitted it. 4 Victoria Crosses were awarded to Chindit forces, 27 Distinguished Service Orders, 112 military crosses, 89 military medals, 378 mentioned in dispatches, and numerous Commonwealth and Allied decorations recognized extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. The legacy endures. The 77th Brigade was recreated in 2015 by the British Ministry of Defence for cyber warfare and information operations, continuing to use the Chindit emblem and motto. The boldest measures are the safest. Those words, taken from Macaulay's essay on Lord Clive, define the Chindit spirit. When conventional wisdom said, British forces could not fight in the jungle, could not operate behind enemy lines, could not survive on air supply alone, the Chindits proved conventional wisdom catastrophically wrong. They did not win the Burma campaign alone. They suffered casualties that haunt military historians to this day. They sparked debates about resource allocation that continue among scholars. But they accomplished something that transcended tactical considerations. They restored British confidence after devastating defeats. They proved Commonwealth forces could match Japanese jungle capabilities. They tied down enemy divisions at the decisive moment of the war's critical battles. And they earned testimony from Japanese commanders that validated their strategic impact beyond any doubt. The Japanese expected British forces to collapse when faced with their jungle warfare supremacy. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy who marched further, fought harder, and endured more than they thought possible. An enemy who cut their supply lines. An enemy who appeared behind their supposedly secure positions. An enemy who forced them to divert precious reserves at the exact moment they needed those forces elsewhere. An enemy who, in the words of their own commanders, they could not easily be engaged. That was the British reversal the Chindits delivered, not through propaganda or boasting, but through documented operations that forced Japan's senior commanders to admit what they had discovered too late. They had found their match in Burma's jungles, and that match helped doom their last great offensive, alter the strategic balance, and contribute to the eventual liberation of Burma. The survivors knew what they had accomplished. Whatever happened to them after Burma, they knew nothing else would ever be as bad. They remained Chindits for the rest of their days, members of a brotherhood forged in extreme adversity, men who had marched 1,000 miles through hell, and proven that British forces could fight, survive, and triumph in conditions their enemies thought impossible. Men who earned their place in history through courage, endurance, and determination that redefined what was possible in jungle warfare. The Japanese never expected it. Japan's commanders admitted it changed everything. The documented evidence proves it beyond doubt. The Chindits delivered a strategic reversal that helped alter the course of the Burma campaign, backed by the ultimate validation, enemy testimony admitting British forces had achieved what they never thought possible.